speaking about Seventh Column, and there was a forum too. So anyone who was invited to Seventh Column could log on to a private forum and leave feedback in the written form, like they would on any internet forum. So yeah, in addition to all the data points, like if we wanted to, we could go plowing through the columns, or sorry, not the columns, plowing through the forums and read actual written feedback. And I remember some people were just like, would use it to rant. Some people would just be like, this is really cool, I like it a lot. And then remember there's definitely some PvP minded players who were leaving long posts about like detailed thoughts about the weapon balance stuff at the time. And yeah, that was cool to see. Yep. But it would tend to get buried, right? Like there'd be a whole bunch of posts and you'd have to do some digging.
Yeah, and it's hard to say, right? I mean, we all monitor stuff and we read it, but like it's rare that we're gonna see it all. Sometimes the UR guys will like collate stuff for us. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's really hard to like there isn't a direct connection to like, I know it got hurt. I know someone
right.
I've always wondered about sort of how you balance across such a wide skill gap, because you have these sort of massive data pools across the entire skill range, and you want to make sure that it's not totally oppressive for somebody who's just getting started in first-person shooters to come in and have a fun round. When you look at the numbers as a whole, do you sort of think, okay, well, this is a weapon type that low-skill people tend to gravitate towards, and they're going to have more luck with this, and we want this to feel easy to use, versus, this is a high-skill weapon that we can make a bit more powerful because it's so challenging to pull off consistently?
So answer is yes. It's yes, it's a pain in the ass. I mean, it's not. I'll tell you, it's not only that, right? Like, yeah, that's bad enough, but that's just a standard multiplayer game. Like, that's fine. The thing that makes Destiny super challenging is that we want to have this global sandbox, right? Like, and I have to like fight to hold that together, or try to keep it together, where like, on one side, on the PvE side, like we want you to feel like you're making progress, and we want you to have those RPG elements that like, hey, I'm getting a new thing that I care about, and like I'm investing in it. And like, if I give you a new gun, like if Noose releases a new exotic which is flat not better or flat worse than everything else, right, like that's not going to go over well. But then on the same time, at the high-end skill level, right, like we get a bunch of benefits from you being able to take your same character across multiple different activities, but I'd say that actually causes us a lot more pain and like back and forth, and like how do we make it feel like you're progressing without actually increasing the your global ability to just put down damage and kill stuff, and you get this mudflation going on. But I guess to directly address your question, yes, we talk about it. We talk about skill gap and how much is in the game all the time. I mean, one of the reasons that we allow snipers, like is really contentious as to whether or not snipers would originally be a heavy or a secondary weapon, right? But they're sort of grandfathered in, so you get a little bit more leeway on the like one-hit kill sniper. Because people just expect that, like, well, it has some skill to use, etc. But yeah, there's a bunch of that. So it's how do we ride the line? Because obviously we want enough skill that it doesn't feel completely random, and like it doesn't matter at all. Like, I just show up. But yeah, I mean, there's constantly raging debates all the time in the studio, right? The really skilled players are super mad that like we don't expand the skill gap to be even greater, because they want it to be more like Halo was, where some noob starts shooting at me from behind. I feel it. I turn around. I, jump up in the air, bounce a grenade off the floor, pop his shield, and kill him. And he's like, what the fuck? I totally had the drop on that guy. What just happened? Right? And, the skilled player is like, that's damn right. As it should be. Right? And so, yeah, I mean, we go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth about, where we should be. I mean, and there's there's constantly raging debates all the time in the studio, right? The really skilled players are super mad that like we don't expand the skill gap to be even greater because they want it to be more like Halo was, where some guy, some noob starts shooting at me from behind. I feel it. I turn around. I, jump up in the air, bounce a grenade off the floor, pop his shield, and kill him. And he's like, what the fuck? I totally had the drop on that guy. What just happened? Right? And, the skilled player is like, that's damn right, as it should be. Right? And so, yeah, I mean, we go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth about, where we should be. I mean, interestingly, like, internally, I'd say now, most of us feel that it's a little bit too fast, and that we'd like to see, a little bit more like of that gap added back.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would also say that like it's not just that we look at it and we feel that we all agree it's too fast, but the speed and correct me if I'm wrong, Sage, but when you say too fast, you're specifically talking about time to kill. Just like the ways that you can eliminate a guy.
I'm talking about the feeling of chaos in the game, but yes, that's contributed by the by time to kill plus movement modes. Like it's like map control is a problem because I gave you all this sweet shit to fly around with, right? Like
yeah,
I'm aware.
Yeah, yeah. That speed and that chaos are things that tend to develop organically and in an unplanned way. So, we'll make a bunch of sweet shit, we'll put it into the game, we start bashing it against each other and play testing. And it feels fun, but then there's also this feeling of like, okay, that's now we need to figure out ways to like reel it in without diminishing the fun factor.
That's really interesting. I would say, just sort of thinking about my experience of the community impression with these most recent changes to shotguns, I think a lot of people have felt that it's kind of slowed the game down a bit, and I think this is a little bit of a reduction of the problem. They say, well, now everyone's just hard scoping with their snipers, which I don't think is accurate, but I think that's sort of the main dimension of like shotgun versus sniper and what a skilled player can do there. I think a lot of it too has to come down to whether you're playing 3s or 6s, and I think in 6s that sense of speed is still there, but in a lot of ways I think players feel it's really slower than it's ever been, or maybe than it's been for most of year one with Blink Shotgun. Is that a direction you find yourself still wanting to push to slow down a bit more?
We go back and forth with PvP guys, but for me personally, like I prefer the pace of the game to be like 3-on-3, more controlled, not super fast, but like I'm old and slow, so that's how I like it to be a little bit more controlled, right? And some players prefer it to be super fast, right? Really, really quick.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I've been saying this ever since before the game release, but I think Destiny PvP is at its best, absolute best in skirmish. I think that is
You're here.
That is the most fun, and it is the most distilled and pure version of the PvP game. And then the other 3v3 modes add objectives and other little like interesting nuances to the PvP experience. But I think the most like distilled and pure, and for me most like fun, is skirmish.
We should jump into that maybe and talk about skirmish or maybe elimination and where those games are. Because at least from the feedback we get, and we try to engage every aspect of the community, the people who love Iron Banner once a month and they just play Control and have fun with their friends, and then the guys who are either doing trials carries or playing sweaties every night of the week. And a lot of those guys, of course, shotguns were at one point incredibly dominant. I think universally everyone wanted them to be dialed back just a little bit, or a lot of bit, it depends, and that happened, and I think a lot of it has been good, but they now sort of feel like you lost that art to the skill, and this goes back to the skill gap conversation where someone can be so good with something, and then if you make that item strong, they're that much better. But a lot of fast, aggressive players who were playing sweaties and stuff like that really loved being able to fly across the map with Blink and shotgun someone who's trying to just watch a doorway with their sniper. And at least in the 1.5 weeks we've had to play with the new balance, a lot of conversations are going in the direction of, well, now elimination and skirmish are really slow. It's all about, hard scoping walls and sniping revives and things like that, and it sort of slowed the pace.
No. Yes, that is slowing the game, but I would say that that's slowing the game in a bad way. When I'm talking about slowing the game, I'm talking about slowing like individual one-on-one engagements, right?
Okay.
Not
Gotcha.
the global, like, no one wants to play everyone sits with their snipers really far away until the very last minute and then rushes for the tiebreaker zone or some bad, whatever your worst version of that. That's the one I can think of off the cuff. So we will, I'll say we will certainly look at snipers if they become, super dominant. Some of the stuff that you're talking about can be pushed around by, rules for the game, when you're talking about, specific game types, etc. But I agree, like, I get a lot of flack sometimes for like, wanting most things in the game, major archetypes on the weapons, for instance, to be viable, right? I get a lot of, why won't you just let me play the way I want to play? It's like, well, actually, that's the point. I want everyone to be able to play they want to play, and I don't want a particular play style or archetype to be dominant. I don't want, Thorn to be the only way to play, and I don't want 1,000-yard stare to be the only way to play, right? So I would categorize those guys, those sort of guerrilla flanking fighters, as like, I call them marauders or something like that. And certainly that should be a viable option. Now in my perfect world, those guys, they're kind of hanging it out there by rushing the sides, and I would hope that if they fail, their team gets punished a little bit more than they currently do. Like, whatever, when I did Shadowrun, we did clear, right? So if you got killed that far away, we would clear your body, and then you're like double dead, you're super dead. Right? And that was the, like, hey, if you're gonna like swing your balls out here on the line, like, you have to be prepared to like put it on the line. But anyway, in short, no, we don't want the game to result in like everyone cowering behind corners with snipers and like rarely running out, and the entire game resulting in instant kills, right? Like, no, absolutely not. Like, we will push against that if that turns out.
So could that be tied into like the movement of players? Because you took away some of the movement when it came to Blink, as far as like the ready time.
Sure, but I mean, I did that because, again, Blink Shotgun was becoming a very dominant high-end playstyle, and there wasn't much you could do against it, right? You didn't have a lot of an option, and you could say, I mean, the PvP guys will be super pissed. They're like, there's a bunch of stuff that you can't do anything against, right? That they don't feel they have a counter to right now. Mm-hmm. But Blink was one of those things that was just that discontinuous movement on the attack. Was really effective, especially against lower skill players, and we wanted to tone that back so that it didn't blow out of control, where like, everyone's like, the only way that you're doing it wrong if you're not running, an Arc Hunter Blink Shoddy, right? And like, I never want to be, you're doing it wrong for one particular style if you're not playing one particular style, right? I want a bunch of different things to be viable, so that people do have an option to like play the way that they want to play, right? So I want the sniper to be able to play as a sniper. If he wants to, hide invisibly in a corner and snipe, right? Like, I want him to do that, but I don't want him to be able to go 50-0 either.
Well, wouldn't that be nice?
We're going to get into some weapon-specific questions, but before we sort of get into the nitty-gritty of it, I've got a pair of questions here from our good friends Maniac Greek and Invicta. Maniac points out that the latest weapons patch included extremely specific damage adjustments for about half of the primary weapon archetypes in the game, and some of those adjustments were tiny. Invicta is wondering, how come we're not receiving nerfs one step at a time rather than nerfing several areas of a gun? If one thing was nerfed, we could sort of see how that played out. Can you just explain a little bit of sort of the philosophy you guys have for what goes into a single balance patch, and if that's evolved at all over, as we make it to 2.1?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a couple of reasons we do that. I mean, one reason is purely on the psychological end of the players who are enjoying the game and they see the patch notes and it's like Birds, what's your favorite gun?
Mida.
Mida multi-tool. Okay, so what if our next balance pass was reduce damage on Mida multi-tool? That's it.
How dare you?
What?
Hurt my baby.
Right. So part of the reason that we like to do a variety of changes is because we don't want any, like, on the psychological end, we don't want any players to feel like we're singling out their thing that they like doing. Like, Sage just spent a lot of time
That's a
talking
really good
about
point.
play styles and having a variety and making players feel like they can pretty much, like, find the thing that they like to do improvisationally and then do that and be good at it. And I think it really sucks for a player who has found a niche, they have found a style that they really like, and if the patch came out and it was just like, hey, you Birds, that shit you love doing, we're gonna change it. It's not gonna be good anymore. And then you're like, well, what do I do now? So by having a whole bunch of changes like that, I think, there will definitely be targeted things in there that are specifically looking at very specific things. But then what we also want to do is, like, as you digest the whole change log, you can say, okay, well, this stuff is moving, that stuff is moving, what can I try, and we sort of get to where you guys were. I was watching your streams the night of the patch where you're bringing all your stuff out of your vaults, you're trying stuff out, you're trying new weapons, new play styles. You're going to see if there's anything new that's resonating with you, and I think psychologically that's a much more positive impression for the people who are playing the games regularly. And not psychologically, like, just speaking to the actual process of designing stuff, like, as we're doing a balance pass, things move, and you make one change to one thing and it can expose a whole bunch of different strengths and weaknesses in other areas that might need to be adjusted. And so I would think that if we did very singular targeted changes like that, we would end up being somewhat irresponsible unless somehow magically everything just worked fine and we're like, oh, we made one change and the whole game was better for it. Maybe we would try pushing that out, but I think in practice, you make one change and it exposes a lot of other changes that probably need to happen in tandem.
So that sort of that shot package tweak from a few months ago, that was sort of like this is an epidemic, this is a thing we just have to do, kind of an exception to the rule, not something we can expect to see every couple weeks, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some specific weapon types. What do we have first?
So in regards to, like, the high impact archetype for pulse rifles, good friend Holtzman asks, how is the 14% nerf justified? It now takes 3 bursts to kill, just like pulse rifles of a faster firing archetype, and it kind of nullifies their use, if a different weapon does the same thing in a more efficient manner.
That's a good question. Technically, if you're landing headshots, you can still get a 2-burst kill. So, I mean, and that came from a hard question to answer, which was, should pulse rifles be a 2-burst kill? And so in 2.0, pulse rifles were pretty reliably able to, that style of pulse rifle was pretty reliably able to 2-burst kill people. And that time to kill, like,
It's pretty short.
was something we tried. It felt pretty hot, and so we just dialed it back a little bit. And basically, the place it's in now is, it boils down to the player's skill, and it boils down to how much the victim has prioritized their armor stat. So if you are confident in your thumb skill that you can land mostly headshots with that archetype, and you're shooting at a guy who has not prioritized armor, you can still get the 2-burst kill.
I guess it's just because high armor is across the game pretty prevalent that you're not seeing that as often.
You fools.
Sure. I mean, that's a choice that players are making, where they're missing out in other areas. They're missing out on their base agility, which does huge things for your ability to move around the map, and they're missing out on their recovery, which is, like, recovery is huge in your ability to sort of, like, escape a fight and then come back into that fight briefly. Also with the 14% damage reduction, that just happens to be, I mean, because it's high impact and the base damage is a little bit higher, that happens to be the percentage number of the change that it took to reduce the bullets to kill by 1. So that, I mean, the big change that went across for pulses is that the bullets to kill, this isn't bursts, this is actual bullets to kill, went down by 1 for all pulse archetypes. And that percentage happened to be the percentage to get that to happen.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense. So yeah, it's 1 less bullet to kill with all pulse archetypes. And sometimes that manifests in a whole burst. Sometimes that manifests in a burst to the body, but it doesn't matter if you're getting headshots. And then what usually happens with pulse rifles is there's never just body shots and there's never just headshots, right? It's like a mix of the two.
Yep.
If you look at raw DPS, auto rifles are significantly better than scouts, but the scouts have this ability, we call them like finishers or high impact or whatever, right? They basically jump ahead. So over a long enough timeline, auto rifles may do more damage, but scouts have this ability to jump ahead and get the kill. And so since pulse sits in the middle, high impact pulse rifles, like you're gonna be able to, like if the guy's already hurt, if he's somewhat damaged, then you're gonna have a slight advantage, right, for the slightly higher. The same way as the scout. Does that make sense? Am I babbling incoherently, or is that coming across?
With you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're with it.
Well, we got a lot of questions about the last word, and I'm not going to ask any of them because it's like, what do you guys want? Oh, they don't work. Oh, they work too good. Okay, I'm just going to move on to my pet category. We got a lot of questions about.
I might have to bring that back up.
Yeah.
Well, you can wait your turn because I'm going to ask about fusion rifles. And we got a lot of great questions.
Yeah.
I've actually, since last we talked, I have fallen in love with my Thiessen FR4 and fusion rifles in general. I'm just loving sort of that space, and I think I might have picked the right one for Taken King. But let's just start up at the top. We got a question from Larima, who asked a really interesting question, and I don't know what the answer is, so I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. What is the quote-unquote contract for fusion rifles? In previous episodes, you talked about the contract for a shotgun, the contract for a sniper rifle, a one headshot kill versus putting a shotgun in someone's belly. But what should we be making of a fusion rifle?
So I think the reason that snipers and shotguns have a quote-unquote contract is because, like Sage said earlier, they get grandfathered in over multiple games doing very similar things with that archetype of weapon. So with something like the fusion rifle, there isn't necessarily a contract in the sense that I was using it previously. But yeah, the goals for the fusion rifle, I talk about the goals for every weapon archetype whenever we make changes to them. The fusion rifle should reward target tracking over placing like a specific precision shot.
Mm-hmm. It's the same as so ARs reward target tracking versus scouts that reward precision, right? So it's it's a different fundamental skill. So in early prototyping of the fusion rifle archetype, it was this like crazy like Baconator laser beam that like you had to hold on the guy over some period of time.
Interesting.
Morphed over time until it felt good to use, but it's supposed to be this sort of, I track over time, and then now you track over time as you charge it, because you don't know exactly when it's going to come off. I mean, obviously, if you're playing all the time, you're familiar with your fusion, you do.
Fusion rifles also, more so than autos, so the auto rifles reward tracking a target rather than placing a single precision shot, but fusion rifles also reward being able to predict a target's movement. And that is the key to mastering the fusion rifle, I think, is starting the charge and understanding the trajectory of your target, analyzing the possible places they could juke or jump or duck, and then placing that burst in the same spot where they end up. Sometimes that's really easy to do, and sometimes that's really hard to do. So fusion rifles, the goal of fusion rifles is to reward the attacker's ability to predict where their target's going to be based on movement, trajectory, based on the class that they are, all that stuff.
But yeah, I mean, it's also, it's a secondary, so if used correctly, it's a one-hit kill at its desired range. I mean, fusion rifles are interesting because we know internally, and it might be Greg's fault, but we have a guy internally that's just a fucking wizard with fusion rifles, right? And he will just melt your face off. And so even though we don't see it currently reflected in the data, it's one of the things that we haven't touched, because internally we know that like he'll just kill all comers with the fusion rifle, right? Like he does really well. And so I'm basically waiting for the community to pick that up I also got burned. I had a similar mechanic years ago when I did Mech Assault for the PPCs, and like on paper the numbers looked really good, and I kept getting feedback that these are garbage. You should turn these up. What the fuck is this? And so I did, and this is before we could like make patches to games after we released them, and so. For all time now, Mech Assault has way overpowered PPCs. So it might be me holding them down, but on paper they are really good, and internally we have people that are able to use them that they're wizards. So
Yeah, I guess just thinking about like compared to shotguns versus snipers, so many more fusion rifle rounds for me end up in a kill than like my average. I miss a lot of snipes. I take a lot of shotgun, trying to charge in. Just thinking about that. But okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it also seems like within the idea of fusion rifles as a weapon type as a whole, there's also been sort of a finer division between the different archetypes of fusion rifles for sort of sub goals for this is how a slow charging, high impact fusion rifle should play versus a faster charging, like almost in a shotgun territory type fusion rifle.
Yep.
How do those interact? I said earlier, I think I got lucky going with the Thiessen, but I know a lot of people who are fans of the split shifter, some of the more faster charging ones, are just having a lot of trouble getting enough bolts on to get that one hit kill. So
yeah,
how should we be viewing the difference between these?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. That was one of the things that we were trying to do with this patch was help define the roles of the fusion rifles. And man, Greg and I, not Greg the tester that Sage was just talking about, but Greg the designer who helps me on the weapon updates, like we were going back and forth on the nomenclature and the wording of the fusion rifle stuff, and we tried really hard to like very clearly state what we were doing, but we just I think we ended up confusing more people than we ended up providing clarity to. And it's just a really hard thing to talk about, so I'm glad I can talk about it in person now. What we tried to do is we left the long charging time for a few. So charge time and impact are on a seesaw scale, just like rate of fire and impact are for the other archetypes. So the longer it takes you to charge up a fusion rifle, the more base damage your bolts are going to do. So the longer charging fusion rifles, we left those where they were because that felt sufficiently long. There's a lot of like charge up and planning you need to do, and there's a lot of like tense milliseconds there while you're waiting for your fusion rifle to charge up while some guy's barreling down on you. But we wanted to make the faster charging fusion rifles a little bit faster to help define roles for those guys. So the longer charging one, the base stat package you're going to get with that is going to give you better range and going to basically allow you to use it more on the close to medium range of sort of like the defined space for fusion rifles to be effective. And then the faster charging ones are going to have less effective range, but they are now charging significantly faster. I mean, I think if you look at the actual like seconds, the milliseconds that you're shaving off, it doesn't read like a ton, but in game, in practice, you're actually getting a significant boost to speed, and you're able to use those much more reactively than you were. So like, we always wanted like the faster charging fusion rifles to be something that you could use when the guy was like coming down on you with a shotgun and about to take you out, and it was like never really fast enough to like really get you there. So now it's in a good spot with shotgun range coming down. Like the shotgunners have to work a little bit harder to close that distance, and your fast charging fusion rifle should be able to charge up and get the burst out before that guy can close on you, assuming you know he's coming. As far as charge speed goes, that's one of the things that we were trying to do with this patch, is just help define roles for those weapons. Like depending on how you want to use it, that's how you should be planning your fusion rifle, assuming you do want to use it.
Also, Plan C, check it out.
Yeah, check out Plan C. We have some data. We got some data back,
We got some data. You might want to look at that.
Might want to look into Plan C.
Oh boy. So, okay, I'm gonna try to see if I can articulate my personal frustrations over the past 2 weeks. Not like you did this wrong, but like my own inability to like adapt and things like that. And it's kind of been reflected by other people. we've talked about fusion rifles and auto rifles so far being kind of controversial weapons in this last patch, either not being able to notice or noticing changes. Never going to put down my sniper rifle, but then you guys obviously have a goal for them and are confident in the changes you've laid out, and say like maybe eventually we'll pick up on that. So I guess the frustration here is I guess how the opinion of good players sort of differs to
The numbers.
and the changes and the intentions and stuff like that. And how am I supposed to read that if I can say, I know that to win I'm going to either equip Mida or Nurwood's Mercy, but everyone seems to be using auto rifles, even though if you talk about auto rifles, no one wants to use them. If that makes any sense.
I mean, it does. I would just tell you, like, you shouldn't stress out about it so much. You should just, like, roll the shit that feels good to play and the stuff that feels good to you, right, that is successful, right? And if you're doing that, and then if everyone is doing that and the game devolves into all, Sniper Fest, then, we will certainly do something about it. But so some of that can have, like, when we look at data, we generally look at, like, top 10% of players and how do those group, and then bottom 90% and how do those group. And so, we certainly look at different populations there. My, more direct answer to your question would be, I actually think auto rifles are in a pretty good place, and I think fusion rifles have not been discovered yet.
Okay.
My direct, like, relative to, like, millions of people playing over many, many matches, looking at the data that we have.
And I'm trying to also put this out for the sake of conversation. I feel like maybe we need a co-host that's much more fired up about this. I think for the most part, I can approach changes from a level-headed perspective, but I just have to, like, sympathize with people who are frustrated. So I'm trying to get that angle into this conversation when otherwise, for the most part, the three of us are very happy with.
Yeah, I mean,
Not
I would say,
maniacs. Yeah.
We're calm.
Yeah.
I can kind of come from a little bit of an angle on that with the last word. I'm finding that it's quite prevalent right now. That may be, the result of everybody talking about it and all that. But was that really an intention? Like, is that just a side effect from your tweaks that everybody's using this really great gun, or are we just not using all the guns?
That speaks into a little bit of what Sage was saying there. Is just that I think that's people using what they want to use, right? Like the last word, as far as all the weapons in the game go, the last word is one of those exotics that I feel like we really did a good job on. Not making it a lethal, like, killing machine in PvP, but we really did a good job in, like, building a fantasy around this gun. Like, all the lore is really cool. The animation just knocks that out of the park. And yeah, the full auto, like, fan fire animation is just like, it just does a really good job at creating a very, very potent player fantasy that fits into the world really well. So it's a fun gun to use. We also did a good job, like, patting ourselves on the back on the design end of making it like an effective gun, right? So it's like it does all this great stuff for player fantasy, and then also, like, when you use it, it's like, oh, like, this is really like an effective tool at killing dudes. A lot of people got really angry that the last word got, like, I don't know, it was back and forth when the last word got nerfed last time, which I would argue was not much of a nerf. It's just more of a change to help, like, drill in on the fantasy and not allow players to push it outside of, like, the intended gameplay rule. But I think initially people were pretty upset that it wasn't, like, the laser of death that it had been for a long time, and they moved away from it, and now they're coming back to it, and they're realizing that, like, oh, it's still pretty good. Like, it didn't get broken. Like, it just sort of got changed, and now I'm learning to play with it in the new boundaries. And so yeah, to definitively answer your question, I mean, no, it was not my intention at all to bring the last word back into the spotlight. If players are using it again and they're enjoying it and they're having fun, I think that is a positive thing. I actually ran it last night a little bit in anticipation of this interview, thinking that you guys would be nailing my balls to the desk about the last word coming back.
We have a different gun to talk about in that sense.
Sure. And in my in my experience last night, and this is all anecdotal, right? Like anybody's experience and feedback is all going to be based on anecdotal experiences that they're having in the game that pretty much was like one or two people involved. But in my anecdotal experiences running The Last Word last night, it's like, yeah, it definitely does a good job at killing guys in a one-on-one. If there's a one-on-two, you probably have to reload before you take the next guy on, if he's full health. And in that situation, that gun is not the best. And it is the lowest range of any hand cannon in the game as well. So if you're trying to use it at range, you're going to have more of a challenge than you would with any other gun. So I think it's still is not completely out of balance as far as like if you look at it on paper as you know, as a designer. But then if the population of the game just completely gravitates to it again, like they did last time, then we'll absolutely take another look at it.
The unfortunate thing is that if we're doing our jobs well, then probably no one's going to be super happy, which is unfortunate, right? Because it's actually a warning sign for us if we're balancing and someone's like, oh my god, I love this thing. You're like, uh-oh, why do you love it, right? And like, well, I went 5-0 every life, and you're like, oh, okay, that sounds great. So note to self, right? And that sucks, but it's like, again, it's that us trying to make everything reasonably viable in the game, that hey, if you decide that you want to run auto rifles, like you can be reasonably successful, like that is the goal, like that's what we want, but we don't want you just like wrecking everyone's face with it either. Then on top of that, you have this sort of global rolling perception problem, which it sounds like Nusk might have talked about previously, which is just, as like I see this starting to occur for Mida, so it's interesting, right? Like that makes me come in the morning and like look at Mida and be like, whoa, man, I hear a lot of people talking about Mida. What is the deal, right? And then I look at the data and I'm like, yeah. I mean, they used to say like, shh, don't tell Sage, he'll nerf it, right? Like
that was the joke.
But I look at it and it's like, oh, it looks fine. It's not out of bounds, right? But it is starting to get that like popularity, right? And then it has a potential to put us in this really weird space where, hey, the reality is this gun is fine, but everyone is running it. So then everyone starts to think Mida is overpowered. So then we start to get pressure internally and externally to like, hey, what are you guys going to do about Mida? And you're like, well, nothing. And they're like, well, the game's getting pretty boring because all anyone is ever doing is running that. So what are you going to do about it? And so anyway, there's a bunch of vectors there that like contribute to what we do. It's not a perfect science by any means. Like, if we could do I think Valve tried to do that once and like set up their like cost of weapons purely based on like the computer will just figure it out and balance the weapons, right? And like, you can't do that either. So, I mean,
oh, Valve.
Yeah, well,
you adorable geniuses, you.
Yeah, I mean, they're gonna
make computers do everything.
They're gonna do sweet stuff, right? I mean, because we have the data, we could set up some crazy thing that was like trying to do that, but that's not the goal. The goal is to have gems. Like, there is stuff, like, and we talk about this. Like, we get this graph that's like, we call it lift.
I told him about the graph last time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you tell them about the little tiny dots, the like little satellites?
Yeah, there's the secret weapons.
Yeah, there's like
really
secret weapons that are
about.
like super good. Like 300 guys out there are just crushing with this gun, right? And you're like, okay, like leave that, like until that circle gets really big, like it's fine. Like we want those to exist, right? Because then it's like, oh, I found this thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Wouldn't it be advantageous for you to like occasionally just tell the three of us?
I have. Have you been listening?
Yeah, I know.
Would be analyzing this, like playing it backwards and trying to figure out the code.
Yeah, don't be surprised if Bird's like, there's just empty spots in our conversation where you mention weapons.
So one thing I will say in terms of that data is like, yeah, we know which guns are like super hot that not many people are running. We know which guns are like not doing great, like people like to run this gun, but turns out they don't do very well with it.
Actually makes them worse.
Yeah. And one thing I will say to hopefully try and dispel a lot of the hype rumor mill about snipers and aim assist that's going on right now is I will say that 1,000-yard stare, the sniper that everyone is running, is like data that I looked at this morning that is the most current. 1,000 Yard Stare was flat smack in the middle. So it's not making you any better. It's not making you any worse. It's pretty much right on the 1-0 KD line.
But it is easy to get.
And it's easy to get. Lots of people have it. But as far as this whole thing of like, yeah, it's got this insane aim assist and it's just magically bending bullets into people's faces. Regardless of anyone's anecdotal experience of being shot in the face with 1,000 Yard Stare, the data is showing it as a very flat weapon, which I think is cool. Lots of people are running a flat weapon, which means
But
they're getting good at using it, right?
I'll say it's flat on the KD, but it is not flat on the use.
No.
Right?
No.
So you're seeing 1,000 Yard Stare in your kill screen a lot.
Yep.
Which makes you go, fuck that gun!
Yep.
Well, I think we actually talked about that the last time John was on the show, just about the availability of weapons, because, as you know, the popular sniper rifle choice is something that can headshot a revived player, and there are, I think, 3 legendaries in rotation, one being a hunter exclusive, and I feel like that plays a big part into the rage that builds up against one gun, only because, like you said, it is the most available. So I don't know, I know you said that's something you consider, but I didn't know if there was any further thoughts on just the pure availability of stuff, and if that plays a part in how many or what kinds of weapons actually end up in the game or not.
Yeah, so you stumbled on a subject that we've actually been talking a lot about internally right now, which is the res sniping in trials. There's only a handful of snipers out there that can't res snipe, and those, like, before trials became a thing, those sniper rifles were actually pretty highly valued because they were the lighter ones. They held more rounds in the mag. The stability was a little bit better. They didn't kick as hard, and they were easier to. If you missed the headshot, it was easier to do a quick 2-tap on the body. So those were actually very valuable until this sort of like res sniping meta started to creep up in the trials game type. And now those guns are pretty much looked down upon.
You're talking about the ones that won't succeed.
Yeah, the ones that don't do enough base damage to get
Like
the headshot off the res. Yeah, correct. So the res snipe thing is more of an afterthought. If we were to do anything about that, I'm not saying we are or aren't, but if we did, it would be reacting to, in the grand scheme of Destiny PvP, we'd be reacting to an edge case. That's a thing that happens that affects one game mode pretty heavily, but as far as like the entire game goes, that's not a common sniper scenario.
But we're certainly talking about
But we are
it.
definitely aware of it.
We are arguing
Yeah.
about what the correct fix is.
Some heated discussions happening.
I think part of that is that, like, the vast majority of people who are carrying around a res sniper aren't necessarily doing a ton of res snipes. It's just that snipers, more than anyone else, are like crazy attached to their particular gun. And so they think, like, all right, well, even if I'm only going to need the res snipe, 5% of the time, I just don't want to learn to use any other gun because I'm going to get spoiled by it, and I won't, I'll be out
Sure.
of practice with my baby.
Yeah,
What? No, I'm not spoiled. What? No.
Yeah,
what?
and then so if we were to fix, in quotation marks, fix it so you couldn't do that, like, would we have improved, or would we be receiving death threats, right? Like, it varies depending on people's opinion about, like, oh, globally the game got better, but you took away my baby, you son of a bitch.
yeah,
Right, like, yeah.
yeah.
I know where you work.
That's fine.
Actually, like, so I feel like the conversation has kind of moved off of fusion rifles a little bit, and I feel like I already owe the show and your listeners a debt from last time where we promised we were going to really get into how fusion rifles work. So
Let's do it.
I have some stuff that I think I owe the show, and then I think what I hope will help people understand how fusion rifles work a little bit better, and they can start to they can just take another pass at like trying to use them and trying to find a stat package that's going to work well for their playstyle. So the things I want to talk about are basically how range and stability work on a fusion rifle. As we talked about last time, there's a ton of stuff that gets rolled into the range stat. So go back and listen to the old show, listen to everything I talked about with range, apply that to a fusion rifle burst, So keep in mind that like the final accuracy and the basically like, for lack of a better term, the bloom, as you fire the weapon, as that burst goes out, the accuracy blows out and then it comes back as you charge up for the next shot. Think about that, and then also there's a key element for fusion rifles only that the range stat touches, and that is the speed of the projectile. So the lower your range, the slower your fusion rifle bolts are going to travel through the air. The higher your range, the faster they're going to go. Something that anyone using a fusion rifle needs to do is lead their target. You must try and predict where they're going to be and then lead it by a little bit. The best way to learn how much you lead it by is to just practice and practice and practice, and practice with the same fusion rifle. You want a static range stat that you can sort of start to get a feel for, like, how fast is the target moving and how much do I need to lead them by? Because I will say it's not very much. You don't need to lead them by very much, but if the guy is not right up on you and you have your target right on his chest and you fire and he's moving fast, you're not going to hit the full blast on him.
Also, it's important to note that like you can counter the kick on fusions.
Yeah.
And that might be just like on ARs, but the fusion happens faster, right? Like you can, if that's not obvious, like hopefully people just pick up on it and they learn, but like you should learn to try to, you can counter the kick on your own. So you counter the kick so that you're grouping your shots on the guy's moving chest, right? Like, so you're not only leading, but you're also countering the recoil.